Okay, we're back. Oh.
Okay. Bonjour, AQII. Good morning. I was hoping it would be nice this morning and wear a cute little dress and stuff, and but no. Anyway, so I'm a bit angry this morning, so it might show in my presentation, but that's okay because I'm going to talk about politics, and I think politics makes a lot of us angry right now. And I think it's fine to be angry. We're allowed to be angry. We just have to channel that anger towards political action that will serve us, humanity, make the world a better place. So today, I'm going to talk about a lot of things. Might be a bit heavy for Wednesday morning, but I think you're neuro nurses, so you've seen a lot of stuff, so I think you can handle it. I've been a nurse for 15 years. I'm not a neuro nurse, full disclosure. I did work many years in psych, including at Institut Philippe Pinel, so I got to work with a lot of neuropsychologists. And to a degree, one could argue psychiatry is a little bit neuroscience as well. So there are a lot of connecting dots, let's say, between psych and neuroscience. Morning. And so I'm going to talk about political agency in nursing because I'm a very political person. I sort of stumbled into academia by accident. That was not my primary goal to be a researcher or anything like that. I've been an activist pretty much my whole life. I remember my dad taking me to protest to free Nelson Mandela in the 90s. I remember my first protest I went on my own. I was 12, and it was a counter protest to a pro-life group that was organizing a march in Montreal. And so, yeah, that's, I come from a very heavily union-oriented family. That doesn't mean I'm pro-FIC, regardless of what they do, because we got screwed with our last collective agreement, let's just say. Got to be honest about that. But politics is important in nursing, and we don't talk about politics enough. So as somebody who came from a background of very political people, and when I came into nursing, I was stunned by the absolute absence of debate and this obsession with consensus, even to the point where we censor ourselves and don't talk about politics to preserve consensus. Because nursing is profoundly political. It has a long history of politics, for better and for worse. And so I had a chance to do a postdoc in history at the University of Ottawa at the Nursing History Research Unit. And so I guess you could say I'm a budding historian, or a nerd, whatever. But looking at the history of nursing, especially how nursing professionalized itself, has illuminated a lot of aspects that I didn't understand that still affect nursing today, from safe staffing to racism within nursing itself, ableism, sexism, a lot of the internalized misogyny that we carry with us and that we learn in school through mostly the hidden curriculum. Sometimes it's not really hidden. So let's begin. You, or maybe not. Well, so we're going to talk about political agency. There's a lot of definitions to that. We're not going to go through an exhaustive list. We're going to talk about caring, women's work, feminism, women and women's jobs, and what professionalism really is. So one of my mentors since I've been in academia is Amélie Perron. She's a professor at the University of Ottawa, and she works on nursing resistance, nursing disobedience, and nursing whistleblowing in healthcare. And so she's worked on a lot of projects, including whistleblowing during COVID. And she's written a lot about that. And this is on the politics of discomfort. So there might be parts today where we feel uncomfortable, but that's fine. Again, we're nurses. We're rarely comfortable. So I stress here, I'm going to talk a lot about professional nursing. So professional nursing is really the institution that is nursing today. So our order and everything that flows from our professional college and the rules, regulation connected to it. So in school, at work, professional nursing often perpetuates the belief that the only valid political claim for nursing is premised on patients' interest and advocacy, which is a good political perspective to have. I'm not saying it's not good. It's the only position that's comfortable for us because it's much more comfortable to defend patient rights than to defend our own rights. Our healthcare system, I often say, runs on nurses' guilt. If we didn't feel so guilty all the time, a lot of issues would be solved very rapidly because there would not be any other choice than to solve them. I read a few years ago, I didn't put it in here because I can't refine the stats, but the free labor that nurses give, and this is registered nurses. This is without counting the students that do work and are not paid for it. But we work the equivalent of about 5,000 full-time jobs across Canada without getting paid for it. So every time you don't take a break, you should get paid for it in overtime. But when's the last time you asked for that? But that's actually the law, and it's in our collective agreement. But we feel so bad about asking for something that should be ours. So that's something I want to try to start taking out of us because we've been, in many ways, this might be a strong word, but brainwashed to a degree to sacrifice everything about ourselves for the healthcare systems. And often that's framed in the idea that we're not sacrificing for the healthcare system, we're sacrificing for patients. But patients are paying the price as well. And so we have to untangle the language that a lot of our employers use, that the Ministry of Health uses to justify a lot of the exploitation we face as something that's somehow good for patients, because it really is not. And that's a political position that's a lot more difficult to hold, but that's very important for us to hold because there's no dichotomy between patients' care and the conditions of our work. They are the same thing. So political agency. Political agency, you've probably heard about moral agency or ethical agency. So doing what we think is right would be one way to consider moral agency. Political agency is more of a dynamic concept. So it's related to our belief at any point in time and our capacities to engage in social and political change. It can take a lot of forms. It can be something we do, you know, and whoa, that, hello, okay. That was weird. Okay, I need a sip of coffee. So I will give you a few examples. And again, so now I'm going to show you what examples I find positive, but political agency is a thing. It's not good or bad. It just exists, and it can be used in very bad ways, and we'll get to that more towards the end. So what is being a political agent? So you probably all know Gracia Kasaki-Katawa. She is the mayor of Côte-des-Neiges NDG. She's my friend. Totally name dropping. Anyway, I just want you to think I'm cool and not just a nerd. So Gracia is a really awesome nurse, and she's also the mayor of Côte-des-Neiges NDG. She came this close to be mayor of Montreal, but unfortunately that didn't work out. But hopefully she came in second, so maybe next time, we'll see. Gracia's campaign for mayor of Côte-des-Neiges was explicitly based on her nursing experience. She explained her goal of going into politics as a way to care for people in Côte-des-Neiges from making sure that sidewalks are cleaned of snow and ice in the winter to creating islands of coolness in the summer to ensure that people don't get heat stroke. And for her, it was a natural transition from nurse to mayor. She firmly believes that what she does is that she had the experience to be mayor because she was a nurse. And I always found that a really interesting approach to politics. We have Lee Chapman. I don't know if you heard about her. She's the Chief Nursing Officer of Canada. It's a position that was cut in the early 2000s under the Conservative government of Stephen Harper and was brought back about 2.5 years ago by the Trudeau government. So Lee Chapman is a professor at the University of Toronto, but she's also a harm reduction nurse. So she helped found the first safe injection site in Toronto. And initially for a very long while, it was a guerrilla safe injection site in that it was not legal. But people were dying. And so nurses like Lee showed up and said, we need to do this and provide care and provide a space where people won't die if they overdose. So they would open every morning, get shut down every day, and reopen every single day, despite harassment from police, from people in the neighborhood who would literally throw their dog shit at them for trying to save lives. And so she has a long experience of activism as well. And she's a pretty cool woman as well. I put also 2 photos of nurses on strike. So there was one here in Montreal. It was our first strike in 25 years. And although our union leadership to a degree did not était pas à la hauteur, as we say, to the mobilization of nurses during the strike, it was still a good experience, I think, to just go out there. Because for many of us, it was the very first time we ever went out on a picket line. And that's an important experience to have in your life, to normalize labor actions to defend your rights. There was a strike in New York City just before at Mount Sinai Hospital. The nurses there won a 28% wage increase and enforceable safe staffing ratios. So whoever tells you strikes don't work is wrong. Strikes work very well, but strikes work best when they actually bother people. That's the whole point of a labor action. It can't be something that doesn't affect anything because that's the power of the strike, is to show the importance of your work by stopping it. Now, obviously, there are important things where we're not going to just let people die in their beds in the hospital. But there are ways to make strikes more effective, including nursing strikes, while still making sure that our patients don't die because we went on strike. And you probably saw that picture of the one on the bottom right of Aisha Evans. It's a photo that won a bunch of prizes. It's a photo that was taken in 2016 at a Black Lives Matter protest after the murder of Philando Castille by a police officer, a white police officer. But one thing a lot of people don't know is that Aisha Evans is a nurse. And she was interviewed by every major news outlet in the world. I found interviews by her in German, in Polish. People all over the world wanted to talk to her. She was interviewed by Gayle King, Oprah's BFF. The only media or organizations that didn't interview her were nursing organizations. So there was not one peep about her in any nursing journal, magazine, professional newsletter, whatever, not a peep, nothing at all. And considering she has a mural dedicated to her in St. Louis, that's always something I found outrageous. Because in every single interview that she gives, she says that she's a nurse, and it's because she's a nurse that she went to the protests, the Black Lives Matter protest. And obviously that photo was very representative of police brutality, systemic racism in the US, and one could definitely argue in Canada as well, because you see a young woman in, little ballerina flats in a breezy summer dress being approached by 2 or 3 white men armed to the teeth, approaching her as if she's some, dangerous being. And it reflects that Blackness is not something you can put on and off. And that is one of the core issues in systemic racism, is that it is something that is constant and that has permeated every part of life in North America. And so I really encourage you to Google her, because her interviews are amazing. And she, for me, back in 2016, when I saw her photo and found out she was a nurse, I was like, finally, a nursing role model. That's cool. And that's not Nightingale, because I'm not a fan of Florence Nightingale at all. And I got into a lot of trouble for that, because I wrote an article about her and I was threatened with losing my license. And anyway, it was like I had insulted somebody's mother. Anyway, so there's cool neuro nurses too. So again, I'm not a neuroscience nurse, but I did try to find cool neuroscience nurses who did political things. And one that I found is Patricia Lane. She's a nurse. She's also the former vice president of the American Black Nurses Association. And she was one of the driving forces behind the Brain Health Equity Nurse Fellowship, which gives fellowships to nurses, Black and Latino or Latina, Latinx nurses, to create knowledge for and equity in the neuroscience, in nursing neuroscience. So it's been happening since 2022, so it's fairly new, and they have fellows every year. You have Wilma Koopman, who's the former president of this association, who won a bunch of awards. She's a nurse practitioner, but she helped develop guidelines in collaboration with an organization of patients, which I think is fundamental. So she worked a lot with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. So why is care political? So I could do a whole semester on that, but we only have an hour. I think a lot of the issues around care and why care is political is kind of intuitive. First of all, who gets care is deeply political. What kind of care do you get? We're seeing in the US with reproductive health care, women being thrown in jail for having a miscarriage. And the attacks on reproductive health are having an immense impact on women's health, much more broadly than the women who are being thrown in jail for having a miscarriage. Because if you live in a state where abortion is illegal and even miscarrying can be can lead to a jail sentence, that has an impact on your everyday life as a person who can get pregnant. I think as nurses, we're constantly confronted by issues of illness related to people's lives. Social determinants of health, obviously, we know, but equity, access, gender, race. Quebec does a terrible job, well, doesn't do any job at all in terms of getting race-based data. So it's very nice to say. So then we have a minister of the lutte contre le racisme who can say there is no such thing as systemic racism because there's no data. And if there's no data, then it's not a problem, right? I think in neurosciences, I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of articles that I did find talking about neuroracism, especially when it comes to research. So a lot of research in neuroscience is exclusively white patients. And Black patients are often refused access to these clinical trials because of hair, which is a profoundly racist thing to do. And there doesn't seem to be any way forward right now that's being proposed by funding organizations like CIHR or others. Women are also vastly underrepresented in any clinical trial, especially when it comes to medication. There was a bit of a scandal in 2016 or 2017 when a medication that was supposed to be the Viagra for women hit the market, and we found out that it had never been tested on a single woman. Yet it had passed all the steps required for a medication to hit the market. There had been clinical trials, but the only people enrolled in the clinical trials were men. So why is that? So why would pharmaceutical companies not want women in a clinical trial on meds? So we have the menstrual cycle. Does that affect the proportion of water versus fat versus circulating fluid in our bodies? It sure does. And how does that affect the distribution of medication in our bloodstream? So that's the main reason why pharmaceutical companies have said they don't want women in clinical trials. But that has meant that every single one of the dosages proposed when you look at the monography for medications is based on a typical or sort of a standard white man around 60 kilos, 70 kilos, and healthy. And so since 2016, when that medication came out that was supposed to be marketed to women that had never been tested on a woman, CIHR started asking that if you do a clinical trial for medication, you have to include women, at least some women. You don't have to have 50%, but you have to have a few, just to say. And if you don't have any women, you have to justify it in your grant application. That doesn't mean you can't get the grant, but you have to justify it. So we're still a ways away from what we need. But again, the fact that women have to be in clinical trials or has to be justified that they're not it hasn't even been a decade. So most medications that are on the market right now likely have never been tested on women or have been tested on very, very few women. And I actually found a really cool article on neurofeminism about research in, because especially so Alzheimer's, for example, women are disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's. So there's a lot more women with Alzheimer's, for example, than men. And yet most of the research is on men, same as for the medications. So the idea is that there should be better representation, both in terms of gender, race, and broader categories of people so that who are more affected by certain neuro illnesses, and to ensure that they be represented in the clinical trials or the research that's being done on those illnesses to help find better cures. Okay, so what does this all have to do with nursing? So again, I'm a historian. I guess you could say I'm still feeling like an imposter when I say that, but the foundations of professional nursing, not nursing or caring as a whole, but professional nursing, how we became professionalized was that still determines today a lot of the issues that we face in terms of feeling that we have no voice, censorship, omerta in the healthcare system, being underpaid, overworked, etc. So when did nursing become professionalized, or when did it begin? You've probably heard this a million times in nursing school, right? It began with a white British bigot called Florence Nightingale. And she basically said, hospitals are terrible places. Everybody hates hospital. Everybody avoids hospital like the plague because they could literally give you the plague back then. But let's force all nurses to work and train in hospitals. So there was no real, so back then nursing, where we really come from as nurses, was community-based because hospitals were not good places to work. You could literally, if you went to jail, you could choose between jail or working in a hospital as a nurse in exchange for a sentence. That's how one of my favorite nurses, Emma Goldman, actually became a nurse. She became a nurse in jail. She was an anarchist and a feminist in the early 1900s. Anyway, so nursing, caring was deeply embedded within communities. Nurses would go to people's houses, were often unregulated, autonomous workers. They weren't necessarily shackled to a physician or to an institution. They could actually do work, whether it be wound care, chronic illness management, community care. That's what nursing historically has always been. We moved into hospitals because of the Nightingale reform, and that was probably the worst thing to ever happen to nursing and to patient care. While it drove a lot of technological advances that are good, I'm not saying it's all bad, I'm just saying a lot of it is, because a lot of it is put forward as something that was universally good. There's nothing to criticize. Being a profession is great and fantastic, and it improves patient care. I've not seen a lot of data that show that professionalizing nursing actually had that big of an impact on the quality of patient care. So the Nightingale schools, so this was the peak of the British Empire. Colonial violence everywhere, destroying civilizations and peoples, including genocide against Indigenous people here in Canada. And so Nightingale really championed British imperialism to force the establishment of her schools everywhere. She had probably the most far-reaching impact that anybody ever had, in great part to her political connections. So she was definitely a political agent, but not necessarily for the betterment of humankind. She advocated, she's a bit what a lot of people or in gender studies call white feminism or liberal feminism. She fought for white women's rights in Britain to also profit from the spoils of colonial violence and world domination. She did not fight for the emancipation of women. She fought for the right of white women in Britain to exploit other women who were not British and not white, and for them to be able to have the kind of life that rich white men in Britain can have as well. So interestingly, Nightingale was against professionalization, so against registration initially. But moving nursing from communities to hospital had a profound subordinating impact on nursing work. Because going from, I don't know if any of you ever worked in community care or in community organizations, but there is a gulf between the professional autonomy that we have in community care versus in a lot of hospitals. And I'm not saying all hospitals, you know, specialized hospitals are usually better. I worked at the Cardio Institute in my life and it was pretty cool. But there's still, hospitals are profoundly medical institutions that work around medicine more than anything else, more than around patients, more than around nursing. They are reflective of medical specialties. And so forcing nurses to train within the hospital system and building hospital schools in a way where nurses were entirely subordinated to physician authority and hospital administrators' authority basically shackled us to the hospital system. In a lot of, up until the 60s, a lot of hospital schools didn't even hire graduated nurses. There was a report that came out in the 60s and another one in the 30s where there had been an examen, an investigation into the quality of the hospital schools. And Helen Masalem, who's a very famous McGill nurse, wrote a report where she found that most hospital schools didn't even have teachers. You were basically taken by the school, made to work for 3 years, and then you had a nursing license. And why was that? Because hospitals, of course, they had a captive workforce that needed to work there for 3 years in order to get their nursing license. And so it was through Masalem's work in investigating the quality of teaching, quote unquote, in those schools that led hospital schools to eventually close because hospital schools were too tied to hospital administrations, and there was a competition for hospital administrations between their need for workers and the need for students to have an education. And so that was one of the driving forces to close hospital schools because you can't put the education of people under the same people that also require those people to work for the hospital to function. There was a clear conflict of interest there that lasted for over 100 years. So that's something that happened at the turn of the century. Late 1800s, early 1900s is when we really saw the golden age of hospital schools. And Nightingale justified a lot of what she defended as her schools as a replication of the gendered roles of men and women in society in the hospital. So the physician would be the husband, the nurse would be the wife, the nurse would stay in the hospital, never to leave the hospital except to go to mass. And the patients were like the children. So this is the model professional nursing was built on. And we can deny it all we want, but there is historical facts based on that. So whether you're a man or a woman or a non-binary person doing nursing, it is considered a woman's job in the social imaginary, and it is based on profoundly sexist and racist conceptions of society and human beings. And a lot of that is because nursing itself perpetuates this. So I remember I did not hear the word feminism until the second year of my master's during one class, one very short class. And I was always kind of surprised because we always try to pretend gender has nothing to do with our work. And yet 90% of nurses are women. It is absurd to pretend that it has nothing to do. No, don't worry about it. Just let's pretend that doesn't exist. And that ends up, I've heard so many nurses say, oh, if only we had more men in the profession, we would be so much better off. Now, I'm not saying we don't need more men in the profession. We do. But that is not the problem. It's the fact that we're women, men, non-binary people. That is just a characteristic of biological characteristic of who we are. It can never be a problem. You should never feel bad about being a woman, a man, a non-binary person. There's nothing to feel bad about that. That is not something you can control. What is problematic is sexism. That's the problem, because women's work When you work in a job that's considered women's work, your work is considered a duty, not a job. And so nursing was built on the foundation that we need to sacrifice everything for the greater good. We are angels. We heard that lexicon during the pandemic. You probably heard when François Legault said on TV that when he wanted physician specialists to come work in CHSLDs, he said, but we would never ask you to do orderly's work. You're going to do the nurses' work, and the nurses are going to do the orderly's work. I still get angry saying that out loud. But he said that. It's still available online in his conférence de presse that he used to do. And I remember I worked with I was in CHSLD during the pandemic, during the first wave. It was horrible. I still have nightmares about it. But I had two specialists work with me. They were paid $210 an hour. One was a radiologist, one was an ophthalmologist. How good did you think they were working with fragile older people? And it's nothing against them. They were great people, hardworking. They really wanted to help. But they had no clue what the fuck they were doing. And they were paid 10 times at least more than anybody else that was working there. And we had to train them. The radiologist didn't even know how to put on and off PPE. It's not his fault. When's the last time you spoke to a radiologist as a patient? Never. It's not, they don't usually speak to patients at all. And so to assume that because a physician is a physician, he or she can just do whatever anybody else does in the healthcare system is absurd, but it's a common belief, including among our political leaders like François Legault and the Minister of Health. And that is very, 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 very problematic for us, for patients, and for the organization of healthcare as a whole. Because when we have a Minister of Health who thinks that a radiologist can do the work that anybody else does in a CHSLD, what does that say about the kind of reform that he's going to propose for our healthcare system? What does that say about the people he surrounds himself with that inform him about the healthcare system? These are dangerous things that we need to be much more aware of and that we need to fight. I used to be somebody who was allergic to the word vocation. I still kind of am, but then I had one of my good friends tell me, you know, Nat, physicians talk about their vocation all the time. And they have no problem with it. Why is that? So it's a lot like we've seen, you know, when a woman does something versus when a man does it. If a man talks with a lot of emotion, he's passionate, ambitious. If it's a woman, she's hysteric, irrational. These are deeply ingrained prejudices that we have in our society. And so it's the same with vocation. Even though more and more physicians are women now in Canada, and the majority that are studying now to become physicians are women, it still remains, structurally speaking, the politics of medicine are still profoundly patriarchal. And in the social imaginary, it's a man's job. So that doesn't mean that it is, but it's not just a question of how many people, men, women, non-binary people are in that profession. It's also the structure, the foundations, and the history of that profession that determine whether it's a man's job or a woman's job. In nursing, we have a wage gap. A lot of people are surprised at it. So historically, women are paid less than men in every single job, including nursing, believe it or not. It's slightly lower than in healthcare in general, but those are the general stats. So it's not broken down in terms of immigrant women, Black women, women with disabilities, or this is just overall. So it'd probably be worse if we had a lot of other categories. We talk a lot about the glass ceiling, but in women's jobs, there's what we call the glass elevator. So the glass elevator is, and this is not the fault of men. This is what nursing does. This is what we perpetuate and promote. And it's a lot because of how we're socialized into nursing, mostly through hospitals, because every single one of us, whether we want to or not, we have to go through the hospital system in our clinical rotations. That's where we learn to be a nurse. That's where we learn the hierarchy. That's where we learn the social relations. Who holds the power? Who do we need to defer to through our clinical rotations? So we talk a lot about leadership in nursing, but then we throw students into hospitals without explaining to them what hospitals are. And so the glass elevator is when somebody, when a man in a woman's job rises much faster than any other woman. So if you look at, I mean, you know, we have a man who's the president of our Order of Nurses. We've had 2 consecutive presidents of the Canadian Nurses Association who were men. Most of the deans of nursing schools, I think it's just over 50%, are men. So the higher you go in the professional hierarchy, the more there are men. The more it's white, the more it's male. And that is a visible consequence of systemic racism and systemic sexism in our society. And that's not to say the men are not competent or anything like that. It's just they are disproportionately represented in leadership positions and tend to rise much faster in the ranks because we think as nurses, as head nurses and nursing directors, that men are more rational and that they're better than us just because they're men. And that's something we need to shake off as well. Because even nurses that I know who are strong women, who are feminists, who are, you know, activists, we say things sometimes and it's insidious the ways in which it embeds itself into our professional practice. So I want to talk a little about professionalization because that's what I'm working on right now. We talk a lot about professionalism and the professional project and professional this, professional that in nursing. But what is that really? What does that mean? We talk a lot about professionalism as a virtue, but is it really a virtue? What does it mean? So I spoke about the Nightingale schools initially, which standardized nursing. So the Nightingale schools, the hospital schools that were born in the first Nightingale school was 1860. She didn't actually have the first secular school in Europe, though, even though people... Anyway, and just a random fact about her, she never actually worked in Crimea. Which is, you know who did work in Crimea in terms of nurses? Mary Seacole, who was a Black nurse, who Florence Nightingale refused to have on her nursing team. And the Catholic sisters, the Irish Sisters of Charity, who were Catholics, were also refused by Nightingale because she didn't like Black women and she didn't like Catholics. So Nightingale was actually in Constantinople, which was 300 miles from Crimea, from the front lines. So she never worked there, even though she called the Angel of Crimea. Anyway, that's something that's very frustrating to me as a historian, that people think she actually worked in Crimea when she didn't. So hospital schools. So once you start setting up schools, formal schools, that's not an apprenticeship where somebody can go where you can just teach your daughter or a friend or a neighbor to be a nurse like you, what happens? You begin controlling who gets to call themselves a nurse and who doesn't. You begin to create a group that is more and more homogenous. And that is what professionalization did. So before hospital schools, it was more community-based. There was less regulation. And I'm not saying that regulation is all bad, but we have to look at regulation as a political process. If we pretend that it's not, and it's just universally good, then we don't understand what it is. And if we don't understand what it is, it's hard to fight for it in the right way or to understand how it impacts our work. So the schools, obviously, do you think the initial Nightingale schools allowed Black students, Indigenous students, even Catholic students? There's a reason why nursing remains disproportionately white to this day. It's because Black and Indigenous students, especially, were held back. We're not allowed to enter the nursing schools. But beyond that, which is important to say, is that nursing existed before the hospital schools. So what the hospital schools and the Nightingale reform allowed nursing to do is erased all the previous history of care and nursing and community care that existed before the hospital schools. And the entire history of nursing now is based around Florence Nightingale and her reform. It's like nothing existed before it. And yet, caring for people, nursing, arguably, could be a defining trait of any human society. And so to erase all that is one of the most, how to say this politely, it fucking sucks, okay? Because it disconnects us from our history. It disconnects us from humanity, from our role within humanity, and puts us in this very narrow box of what it means to be professional. You go to the hospital, you give meds, you do this, you do that. And it turns our profession into something that's very narrow and does not allow us to experience the incredible richness that has existed since the history of humans on this planet. So professionalization is always a way to homogenize a profession, a job. That's a fact. Professionalization means the government tells you, you now have a law, you can self-regulate, you create a professional college. Do you know what the first nursing association in North America was? The first professional association, the one that fought hardest for the formal recognition of nursing as a profession in Canada and the US, was the Association of Nurse Superintendents of Hospital Schools. So that's another thing that the hospital schools created, was it allowed for an elite to coalesce, to develop around the leadership of the hospital schools. And obviously this leadership was entirely white. And going with Nightingale's vision, usually women from well-to-do families. Because Florence Nightingale profoundly believed that if you were upper class, you were just better. And that people from the lower classes, women from the lower classes, should never become superintendents of schools. So professionalization intentionally homogenized nursing into a white middle-class nursing profession. And that was one of the ways that nursing work began to be stratified. So I'm a registered nurse. I do essentially no nursing in my day-to-day life. Yet an orderly who does more nursing work than I do could never call herself a nurse. So it's important to understand that professionalization is a privilege, right? We fought for that registered nurse title, but does it really mean that we're more of a nurse, less of a? If you start looking at nursing as work, it becomes much broader. So I do nursing research, but most nursing work is probably not done by nurses in a lot of ways, because we've stratified the work that we used to do. So at the beginning of hospital schools, nurses did everything. Now it's very stratified, especially racially stratified. So that was one of the consequences of quote unquote modernity, is the professionalization of some women's work that allowed white women to exploit the labor of immigrant, Black, Indigenous women. So there used to be only nurses and physicians in hospitals. Now we have orderlies, LPNs, all kinds of people that do very different work than what nursing was originally. Not as we've dichotomized the holism that we like to talk about in nursing, where we do everything for a patient. but we don't really. We tell people to do it, and we take report from the people that do it, but we're not. And I'm not saying it's bad, so I'll come back on that. I know. What time do I have? 9:30? Okay, so I'll try to. Okay, thank you. But I don't want to bore you either. So if you've never read the book, Black Women in White by Darlene Clark Hines, you should read it. If there's this only one book you should read on nursing history, it's that one. It's the most incredible book on the history of all nursing. It's called Black Women in White, but so it follows the development of Black nurses in the US, but it is deeply intertwined with the rise of professional nursing. It is the best book I have ever read on nursing history, and it's well worth reading. So Darlene Clark Hines really analyzes how the obsession with the professional project by white nursing leaders led them to champion segregation, political policies that were bad for people's health. What I'm working on right now is how professional nursing destroyed midwifery in Canada, for example. A lot of the same year in Quebec that nursing got its first corporate law to become a profession was also the same year that midwifery became illegal here. And nurses were central to undermining midwifery. Anyway, if you want to talk about that more later, it'd be interesting. And now that midwifery became legal again in 2002, guess who was on the board to determine what midwifery should and shouldn't do? We had nurses and gynecologists and obstetricians. Anyway, so this obsession for professionalization stopped us from developing solidarity and support. So we chose regulation over emancipation. And that is deeply problematic, but that's something that we can still address today. So I don't want to like depress you or anything, but it's important to know these things to understand where we come from, because that's where we're still going unless we change course. So we talk a lot about leadership. I have a love-hate relationship with that word. I find we use and abuse the word leadership. You know, if you go to work every day and smile, you're a leader. I don't think that's the case. Leadership is not, I heard there's even a master's program now in leadership. So leadership of what? I don't know, but it's like you can just be a leader of nothing really, but you're like a leader. That's sounds a bit absurd to me. Leadership means there has to be something to lead, right? You can't just be like, oh, I'm a leader today and tomorrow, and just because, you know, I don't know. So leadership is something that should be built around movements and change and policies and politics. But so to come back on professional nursing, political agency and understanding our history and understanding the political place that nurses occupy in society today is essential, because nursing and nurses have been instrumentalized many, many times in history to support terrible things. I don't know if you know, but the last Trump convention, the Republican National Congress, one of their keynote speakers was a nurse practitioner. And she was spewing all kinds of anti-vaccine crap nonsense. One of the first countries where nurses became formally recognized as a profession, and we have to understand a professional college is an extension of government, right? It's delegated powers that are given to a group to regulate themselves, but you still belong in the state apparatus. In Quebec, we belong to the Ministère du Travail, and we work under l'Office des Professions, but those are government bodies. So one of the first places in the world where nursing became professionalized was Germany. In 1905, I think, was the first professional college in Europe. And we all know what happened a few years after that. So there's a lot of documentaries and books about and articles about the Nazi nurses of the Second World War. It's interesting actually because two well-known nurses in history, Irene Sendler, she was a Polish nurse who was also the civilian who saved the most lives during the Second World War. She's the most incredible person. She was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And Al fucking Gore got it instead of her because he made a movie about the environment. Anyway, she saved 2,500 kids from the Warsaw Ghetto. And just Irene Sendler, for me, like with what's going on right now, I like to read about her life because it helps me, it gives me hope. So Irene Sendler was a nurse. She became a nurse because the Nazis, when they occupied Warsaw, they put Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto, but they didn't want any diseases to contaminate the rest of Warsaw. So they had public health nurses that would go in to monitor for typhoid, things like that. And so Irene Sendler did that, but she was the leader of the resistance against Nazi occupation in Poland. And so she would remove children from, to find them families so that they wouldn't end up in the gas chambers. She did this with the consent of the parents, and she took with her, every time she took a child, as much information as she could on that child, birth certificate, names, where they lived, who their parents were, their families, because she believed the war would end and that she could reunite those children with their families. And after the war, she spent 20 years on her own trying to reunite all the children that she placed with the families that they got. So she spent over 30 years working on this. She was arrested a bunch of times during the Second World War. She was considered by her own professional organizations as a criminal. But on the other hand, you have people like Irmgard Huber, there was one woman tried in the international trials when the American army invaded Germany. And she was also a nurse. So Irmgard Huber was the head nurse at the Hedemar Hospital, which for over 20 years was one of the eugenics centers of the Nazis. And she authorized the murder of 15,000 men, women, and children over the course of 20 years. And do you know what her defense was when she was on trial? I just followed my code of ethics. My professional regulatory body told me to do this. I had no choice to do it. So just remember, a professional college is a political institution that is tied to power, and our code of ethics is something that should be alive and something that we should interact with and that we should work to change if we find there are parts of it that are unjust or do not represent what we believe care should look like. Obviously, that defense was not accepted. She was sentenced to death. Unfortunately, that sentence was commuted. She's dead now, though, which is great. But it's important to understand that professionalization is deeply political. And our professional order is something we should have a dynamic relationship with, not one of complete subordination and obedience. Obedience is never particularly good. So that being said, nurses are a force. If we had the proper union leaders, nursing leaders, political leaders, but we can develop that on our own as well. It remains outrageous that to this day, there is no law, no regulation for safe staffing for nursing. That should not exist. This should not be a problem in 2025. In Quebec, there's a law for veterinarian offices. They can only have so many animals in the vet office, and the cages have to be cleaned twice a day. Okay? There is no such thing. When I was working for an agency, I once had 2 floors, 178 patients. What can you do in 8 hours? Not because I take my breaks, in 7.25 hours. It is just, it's physically impossible. We're not rocket scientists. We cannot be in two places at once. We have not yet the technology to develop wormholes to be in two places at once. And yet that is what is asked of us. And if something happens, it's our fault. So we have immense responsibility, but very little authority to make sure these things can happen the way they should happen. And that is not okay. And it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to demand better ways to help us organize our work in the way we have clinical judgment, right? We keep talking about clinical judgment, reflective practice, blah, blah, blah. But then when you start work, it's like this protocol is like scripture. You must respect every single aspect. Clinical judgment, we are so rarely asked to actually use our clinical judgment, especially when it comes to things that affect policy. So we can't decide, you know, a manager can just say, well, you're used to having 4 patients, but today you're going to take 9. That should be an incident report because it puts patients at risk. So we need to ask for overtime when we don't take our breaks. And I know it's hard to do because I know sometimes our worst enemy is ourselves. And I know sometimes colleagues are going to look at us like, why would you do that? But if we don't do it, it's like when they say, if you don't use it, you lose it. This is in part what led to this terrible collective agreement that we ended up with after our last strike, because we're so used to undermining ourselves that even a little bit of extra seems like a win, but it's not. We have to look not just at us as our job, but we have to look elsewhere as well. The government keeps talking about a shortage of nurses. There is no shortage of nurses in this province. Quebec has never had so many nurses in its history. We've never had so many nurses, so many registered nurses than we do now. Never in our history. We have more nurses than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, thousands more. So is the problem a shortage of nurses, or is the problem a shortage of decent working conditions within which nurses are willing to work? If you look at the problem that way, then we can start finding solutions, structural solutions, long-term sustainable solutions, rather than just throwing bodies at the problem. It's an analogy I like to do. It's kind of absurd, but if you have a giant hole in your bathtub and you keep trying to put water in it, your problem is not a shortage of water. I mean, technically you could say it is, but you'll never be able to take a bath if all you think is you have a shortage of water. You gotta fix the hole. And so our healthcare system is a leaking bathtub, and nurses is what's leaking out. And we have every right to leave toxic situations, jobs that don't respect us, don't allow us to use our clinical judgment, don't allow us to have a say in the kind of care that we should and could be giving patients, that puts us in situations where we're constantly faced with ethical dilemmas into which care should I cut today? And puts us in situations from forced overtime to des gardes, etc. We are worth more than that in the healthcare system. We're not numbers, we're not furniture that you can move around, that is undignified, that is disrespectful of our expertise and our competency. And we have to start understanding and really embodying that we understand the worth that we bring to this healthcare system. Because until we do that, we will accept working conditions that are unworthy of us. And I know it's hard, but it's something we really need to fight for, because it's something that will make nursing better, the healthcare system better, and society as a whole better. Because our healthcare system is essential to the health of the population, to the health of this province, and to this entire country. So voila. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Okay. Any questions?
Now you worked us up.
Yeah. Woohoo, let's go protest somewhere. Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Just to say, oh my God, that's really loud.
It's weird.
Just to say your presentation is incredible. My second question is, do you actually offer classes at McGill? Because I don't know, you inspired me to take a class and just learn more.
Oh, that's sweet. I mean, I talk a lot. I give classes at U of M, but yeah, I mean, I sometimes I'm invited to speak at McGill, but you know, I'm always down to. Maria, you can leave my email. I'm always down to go for coffee with somebody or beer or food or whatever. Like nursing is my community, so I'm always happy to develop better networks of mutual aid and mutual care.
You're coming for part 2?
Yeah. Yes, anytime. So yeah, so like I'm always happy to just hang out and talk. I have a lot of former students that still write to me if they have like, oh, this manager forced me to stay in forced overtime and things like that. What do I do? So I work with a lot of nurses to help them through those kinds of concrete issues that they're going through. And yeah, so yeah, if anybody wants to invite me to other stuff, if it's a nursing thing, I'll usually do it for free. So unless it's a OIQ thing, because they have a lot of money and I give them $500, $600 almost every year. So they better pay me. But that hasn't happened yet. They don't like me for some reason. I don't know why. So yeah, yes.
Annette, thank you very much for your presentation and thank you for the work you do. I think you've given me some of the best advice for resistance in my nursing career, which was it's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission.
Always.
That's carried me through for a long time. So thank you. I wanted to ask you, because one of the big priorities right now with the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions is to set up this like nursing ratios across the country, minus Quebec. And I wondered how you thought ratios should be enforced and what the consequences should be for institutions that don't adhere to ratios.
So ratios is a whole thing. I was part of a coalition for safe ratios that actually included the OIQ, the FIC, a bunch of nursing organizations, including AQII. And there's still the website, ratioensante.com or something like that. And it had there's a whole pamphlet. I can send it to Maria and she can send it to the email list, but it has a lot of arguments. It's a really well-built data set and argument for safe ratios. I'm not the kind of gal that likes one size fits all, because one size fits nobody usually, or very few people. So it's not the same if you're working in primary care or, you know, an acute unit. So I think there has to be ratios, but I think nurses need to be part of that discussion and decision making, not just discussion, but the actual decision that are made in the end. And that has to include skill mix and our colleagues, LPN colleagues, orderly colleagues, physio, PT, OT, everybody, because it affects all of us, not just nurses. And so enforcing it, you know, for a while in BC, they had nurses had to be paid a penalty if there was people missing on the unit. So for every nurse missing that day, all the other nurses were paid an extra $5 an hour, which obviously was very motivating for the hospital to ensure that there was enough staff every day on every unit. So in BC, in British Columbia. And that unfortunately didn't last. It only lasted one collective agreement. The government cut that very quickly after that because it cost a lot of money. But obviously, you know, hospitals answer to the bottom line. Hospitals are not moral entities. They're institutions, bureaucratic institutions. And so there has to be some kind of financial issue because that's the only thing they respond to, really. So it could be something like they did in British Columbia. It could be, there's a lot of ways to do it. I think the DSC in Quebec should be much more on top of that than they are now because it's a direct impact on quality of care. But there's some places, you know, like at the CHUM in the ER, they have a committee on ratios for the ER. So the ER decided on its own, we're going to address this. And it's not perfect, but it's working a lot better just to have those discussions and to have people on the ground part of those committees, and they meet every month. And they've established the ratios that they decided amongst themselves. And they can't always respect it, but at least nurses there see there's a means to get to the ends that we're all looking for. So that's been great for retention. It's been great for, you know, retention isn't freaking rocket science, you know, like nurses aren't aliens from another country. We've put retention measures in from another planet. I mean, God, I've been watching the news too much. But, you know, we've put in retention and incentive measures for a bunch of other jobs in informatics industries and stuff like that in Quebec. Why are we so obstinate to not do that when it comes to nurses? We'll do like everything except make our working conditions better. We'll be like, no, more forced overtime, more patients load, you know, that's how we're going to fix this. And obviously that's been what our government has been doing for the last 35 years, and it's not working. So voila. Anything else? Yes.
I have
Maria. Yeah, sure.
so everyone can hear. I'm wondering if you have any kind of suggestions for new nurses that are joining the profession. I think they seem to be struggling a lot at the moment. At least that's what I'm seeing teaching, but
Well, they got screwed so bad with this collective agreement. Like LPNs and new nurses got the short end of the stick on that one. And it's ridiculous and it's a scandal, and we should fight for our relève more than we are. So, I mean, there's a lot of things. I find I've been teaching for a while now, and I find the youngins now are much more in tune, are much more aware of their rights than when I started, for example. So, you know, when I started, there was no question that I would stay 2 hours to finish my notes and not ask for overtime or even pay because I felt so bad that I didn't finish on time. So generally speaking, I find they're better at us than us older ones. But the thing is, they were leaving. So, you know, new nurses stay a few years, 2 years maybe in the healthcare system to get experience, and then they go elsewhere. They become NPs, they try to open their own practice, they do whatever. And they're right to do that. What's missing is the collective aspect. And we've lost, you know, when I started, the union was a lot stronger, but we understood just because we saw our union delegates. So with the fusions, successive governments have purposely ensured that unions would lose power. So the fusions meant that, you know, when I started as a nurse, there was a union delegate on every single floor. If something happened, I could go right away, talk to my union rep, and just, I knew who that person was. I knew their face. We don't have that anymore. We have one union rep per, I don't know how many hundred nurses. And that is not a good thing because we've lost the reflex to do the grief, to use union structures to defend our rights. Now we just leave. And I understand why. I mean, I'm one of those people that have left. But it's important to use the structures that are in place, whether it's the CE, whether it's the union, to enforce the rights that we have struggled to gain. Because again, if we don't use it, we lose it. And that's why it was so easy for the government this time. So there's like a contradiction right now. So I would definitely tell new nurses to get a bit more informed about what the union is and to know their collective agreement. But also, I would tell them to not be afraid. We're so terrified. Nurses are terrified of so many things. And a lot of that fear is irrational. I remember the first time I sent a letter to the Gazette and it got published. When the guy from that section of the newspaper called me to say it's getting published tomorrow, I did not sleep that night. I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get a letter in the mail from the AQII saying I lost my license, that it's outrageous, I shouldn't be talking to the media about this and that. And obviously that never happened, you know? And I've done a lot of press in the last few years. And I've had some terrible interviews. I remember one time, one of my colleagues, I did an interview with a horrible, well, she wasn't even a journalist, she was more of a pundit. But anyway, she was terrible. And it was a horrible interview. And I remember one of my friends called me right after and she said, Nat, did you hear that nurse on that radio show? She was terrible. And she hadn't realized it was me. And I was like, yeah, she was really bad. And, you know, I thought I would have to move to another province or something, but, you know, I'm still here. And so we always tend to think we have to be an expert at something before we comment on something. And that's not true. We're always nursing. We can always give a nursing perspective on something. And we have to stop being so afraid of using our voice, because fear is because we don't use our voice. Once we actually start to use it, that's how we get rid of the fear. And there's consequences for sure. There's risks, but we can manage those risks, and there's ways to do that to make sure you stay safe, or as safe as possible. But you can't move forward without a level, at least a minimal level of risk, because that's not how you change things. So that would be my advice. So I talked too much.
There is one more question in the chat. Hi, Natalie. This question is from Catherine Derry. Thanks for your talk. What is your opinion towards the union relative to seniority? Young nurses with kids not being able to take vacations with their kids, positions being given according to seniority and not much by competency. Do you think that there is union violence towards nurses, that unions are perpetuating the patriarchal hierarchy historical to the nursing profession?
Yes. So again, so unions are tools of social justice and social action, but they are built on a sort of a standard model. So the first unions were built around longshoremen, right? And so most of the union movement, if you look at the history of the union movement, has a structure that is oriented towards male-dominated professions like longshoremen, truck drivers, things like that. So that is not adapted. So nurses, the typical demographic profile of a nurse is a woman in her early 40s with young children at home. That is a very different profile than in a male-dominated profession. So the fact that we have kids, things like that, that, you know, means there are different priorities for nurses than for other jobs. But the union doesn't always adapt to that and doesn't always respond to that. You know, you'll remember the union of the La Fédération des médecins omnipraticiens, back when Barrette was Minister of Health. They had this whole thing where they negotiated a collective agreement for primary care physicians, the médecins de famille, and they forgot to include a provision about maternal leave. And that was because it was Barrette and Dr. Louis Godin, two old white men who were negotiating this contract. And so maternity leave meant nothing for them. So that didn't last very long, but for a few months, female physicians who were on maternity leave lost about 30% of their salary because of that oopsie. So we have to adapt both the union, but also hospitals and our employers, because our employers have a responsibility towards us as well. It's not just the union. And the union, there's ways for us to integrate it and work towards betterment of, because we're always better with a union than without a union. There's no question in my mind about that. But we have to make the union more democratic. And I remember I got in a lot of trouble with the FIC because I was campaigning against the collective agreement. And it was very hush hush. Most people didn't even get to read the agreement before reading it, which should not be legal. Okay, you got to read what you vote on. So there's all kinds of elements like that where I definitely agree the union does perpetuate issues of that. I think because of the successive centralizing reforms, the union, the same as management, has gotten further and further and further away from the actual people they're supposed to represent. And so what happens now is our local executives with our unions tend to have more time with our employers than with the staff. And so that proximity creates a relationship where you identify more to that. So part of it is fighting against the continued centralization of our healthcare system. That is bad for everybody. Dubé campaigned against that, and yet that's what he's doing. Here we are again, fourth reform adopted under Bayon, under duress, and now we're stuck with it. But there's things we need to do to bring back union structures closer to its members, and part of that is getting involved in them, and being vocal on the importance of units and smaller teams, more flexible teams, and being allowed to decide about what happens, not have some faceless bureaucrat decide who gets hired and things like that in the healthcare system in a super centralized place, not hire a Elon Musk type person, which is essentially Geneviève Biron's job in the new Santé Québec. She's just slashing and burning. She didn't get up on stage with a chainsaw yet, but I mean, that's basically her job. So it's important to be vocal about that, to talk about it, and to talk about politics amongst ourselves, and to bring politics into our union meetings, into CE meetings, because these are all things that have a profound impact on patient care and our work. So yeah, so anyway, email me if you want to talk about more about union stuff.